Howdy, today on Flippin Science we're looking at aerobic and anaerobic respiration. Thanks to Sam Moyle for producing this PowerPoint. So science understands we're going to go through. Energy transformations occur within all living cells. Explain how most autotrophs and heterotrophs transform chemical energy through aerobic respiration, illustrated by this equation. So glucose plus oxygen goes to carbon dioxide and water. Explain that fermentation is an anaerobic alternative to aerobic respiration. So in plants and yeast, glucose is turned into ethanol and carbon dioxide, and in animals, glucose is turned into lactic acid. And you need to be able to compare the amount of energy released through aerobic and anaerobic respiration. So most autotrophs and heterotrophs transform stored chemical energy into a form they can use through aerobic respiration. When I'm talking about stored chemical energy, I'm talking about carbohydrates like sugars, I'm talking about proteins, and I'm talking about fats. In all cases, what happens is you're turning that compound into a sugar that can then be broken down, and that sugar is usually glucose. Aerobic respiration uses oxygen to break down glucose into carbon dioxide and water. So glucose has a large number of bonds in it, oxygen has a few bonds, and the products that we're producing have more bonds. That means that more energy is being released, because bonds release energy when they form. So we're turning something big into lots of small things, and when that happens you get lots of bonds being produced, and that means that energy is being produced, and that energy can be reused by the cell to make ATP, the energy storage molecule. Here's a picture showing the process. It's a very complicated process. If you're interested in it, do second year metabolism at uni. I did. It was fun. The first step is called glycolysis. This is where glucose is turned into pyruvate, and this process happens in the cytoplasm, and that produces two ATP molecules from an ADP and a P. From there, the pyruvate feeds into several different reactions. From there, pyruvate is converted into acetyl-CoA, which then feeds into the Krebs cycle, which then feeds, and products from the Krebs cycle feed into the electron transport chain. These processes here happen in the mitochondria of the cells. The Krebs cycle releases 2 ATPs, and the electron transport chain releases 32 ATPs per glucose. So if we add that up, we get 36 ATPs being produced from this whole process using oxygen. The bit that uses oxygen is this stuff over here in the mitochondria. That's the part that uses oxygen, and we can see that lots of ATPs are being released from this process that uses oxygen. So you need to know the equation. So glucose plus oxygen goes to carbon dioxide and water, and you need to know both the chemical equation using our symbols and the word equation too. You can use both. An alternative to using oxygen is called fermentation or anaerobic respiration. So it produces different products, and it produces far less energy per glucose molecule. So in plants and yeast, ethanol and carbon dioxide are produced, and in animals we produce lactic acid. So most of the time in animals, and we're an animal, there is enough oxygen for your cells to be running just aerobic respiration. But when we do something like exercise, we have less oxygen running through our body because it's being used up. So we can switch over to a process that produces lactic acid, and we're still getting some energy out of the glucose that we have stored in our bodies. The problem with this is we get a lot less energy being produced per glucose, so it's not as an efficient process in terms of getting as much energy out of the glucose molecule as possible. So let's look at these two processes. So in plants and yeast we get ethanol fermentation, and we're turning glucose, so C6H12O6, into ethanol, C2H5OH, plus carbon dioxide. Now here's the question, is this balanced? And the answer is no, because we've got 6 carbons over here, but we've only got 3 carbons over here. We've got 12 hydrogens on this side, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We've only got 6 hydrogens on this side. So that tells us what we need to do to balance this. We need to put a big 2 out the front here. And then if we look at oxygens, we've got 6 oxygens on this side. If we double this, we'd have 2, and if over here we would have only 2, so that makes 4, so that means we need to have 2 of these. So if we balance it, we're going to put a 2 in front of both the ethanol and the carbon dioxide. This is the process that's happening, and you might notice that this is the first step here down to pyruvate that occurs in glycolysis that I showed you on that diagram before. So this happens in the cytoplasm of plants and yeast cells. So the glucose is turned into pyruvate, and when that happens, ATP is produced, but only 2 ATPs from the glucose. So here's our ADPs and Ps that we had before, so we're turning 2 ADPs and Ps into 2 ATPs. The other steps here, we get our carbon dioxide being produced and our ethanol being produced when the pyruvate is turned into acetaldehyde, and then that's converted into ethanol. But the key thing here is this process here is happening in the cytoplasm, and we're producing 2 ATPs per glucose molecule. The products of the reaction again are ethanol and carbon dioxide, and we use this reaction, particularly in yeast, to do things like make the alcohol that we drink. In animals we use lactic acid fermentation, so glucose is turned into 2 lactic acid molecules. So you need to remember the formula for the lactic acid, but it's pretty easy because it's just half of the glucose. So C6 turns into C3, H12 turns into H6, and O6 turns into O3. This doesn't show you the chemical structure of the lactic acid, but it gives you the chemical formula. So again, where does this process happen? It happens in the cytoplasm, and if we look again, we can see glucose is being turned into pyruvate, and we're producing 2 ATPs from 2 ADPs and 2 phosphate groups. So down here we're producing lactate. Lactate is lactic acid that's missing a hydrogen ion. So if this is produced in a cell, the hydrogen ion from the cell would join in and that would produce the lactic acid. That's just a little bit of chemistry there, but the key thing is we're producing lactic acid, and that's our C3H6O3. Fermentation also happens in a whole heap of small steps, and they're also moderated by lots of enzymes too. Key thing though is that we're doing glycolysis, but we're not proceeding through to the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain, which releases more of the energy from the glucose molecules. And the yield of ATP is very low in both cases of anaerobic respiration. It's only 2 ATPs per glucose, and that happens from the glycolysis pathway. It doesn't proceed to the oxygen requiring part, which is Krebs cycle and particularly the electron transport chain. So you need to be able to compare aerobic and anaerobic respiration. So in eukaryotes, aerobic respiration starts in the cytoplasm with glycolysis and then finishes off with the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain in the mitochondria. The reactants are glucose and oxygen, and the products are carbon dioxide and water, and that releases 36 ATPs per glucose molecule. Anaerobic respiration only occurs in the cytoplasm. The reactant is only glucose, and the products are lactic acid in animals, whereas in plants and yeast, it's ethanol and carbon dioxide. Big difference, we're only getting 2 ATPs per glucose molecule in anaerobic respiration. Other organisms can do anaerobic respiration too. So lactobacillus, we add that to milk, we let it ferment, and then we produce yogurt. But this is a bacteria, it's not a plant or a yeast. So other organisms can use respiration too. But we're really just comparing aerobic and anaerobic in animals and plants and yeast. We stated before that all these processes happen in lots of steps, and the reason for that is small amounts of energy are released in each step so that we don't get too much energy being released causing damage to the cells. It also allows you to control the reaction so that you can switch off the reaction here and here and here so that you're producing a bit of a reactant, and then you can run that through later, so you can have control of the metabolic processes. In all of these processes, we're turning one type of chemical potential energy into another type of chemical potential energy, and whenever you turn one type of energy into another, you release some energy as heat. It's a byproduct of the reaction, and we use that heat to keep our bodies at a nice 37 degrees all the time. So let's go through our checks. So energy transformations occur within all living cells. Autotrophs and heterotrophs transform chemical energy using aerobic pathways, using oxygen. Fermentation can occur without oxygen, and that produces in plants and yeast carbon dioxide and ethanol, and in animals it produces lactic acid. And you get far more energy being released from the aerobic pathway compared to the anaerobic pathway. So today on Flippin Science, we'll look at aerobic and anaerobic respiration. That's the Flippin Science today. See ya!